Greetings, and welcome to the third session in a series of 5 lectures on the subject of extemporaneous preaching. I believe in my last lecture I said there would be 4 lectures, but there are actually 5. Today, I want to talk about a method of oral rehearsals that, if when used, enables you to deliver what you have written in an extemporaneous oral presentation. I call these rehearsals run-throughs rather than rehearsals, because the term rehearsal has sort of the connotation of performance. And I know people shy away from the idea of a sermon being a performance, and so they don't think rehearsing is right. Even parishioners might think, if they find that the pastor's rehearsing his sermons, they think, well, they want it to come from your heart. They want it to be spontaneous, and they don't think that it's probably the best to be rehearsing it. But musical numbers are rehearsed and performed. Plays are rehearsed and performed. But we do not perform sermons. And the reason is that they aren't entertainment, and they are a communication. And so if you ask the question, why run through your sermon and rehearse your sermon, it's in order to be able to communicate it better. And there couldn't be a better reason for rehearsing than being able to communicate your thoughts and the message that you have to bring in a better way. If we wish to speak our sermons freely, we need a system for converting the written word to the oral word, and it's all about oral rehearsal. In a word, this whole course is about oral rehearsal. And so what we're going to talk about this hour is at the heart and center of this entire little series that we have here. I want to begin with a few general comments about oral rehearsals. First of all, when you orally rehearse a sermon, you do it in sections. You might call them blocks or even chunks. It's little pieces of your sermon. So, for example, if you start out your sermon with a story, that might be the first chunk, and then there's another chunk, and then there's another chunk. And you do those individually and work on those, running through them until you get them down, and then you go on to the next chunk of your sermon. Also, you use your manuscript for not only rehearsing your sermon, but for preaching your sermon. You don't have to, make notes from your written manuscript or anything of that kind. You take your manuscript into the pulpit with you, or put it on a lectern or whatever. And that's what you use to guide you as you preach your sermon, the actual written manuscript. Now, each time you run through a section, you will say it a little differently. And it won't be the same when you actually preach it as when you rehearsed it. Each time it'll be a little different. And that's perfectly normal. That's what happens. It's sort of like telling a joke. If you are going to tell a joke, you tell it differently every time you tell it. You never tell it the same. It's basically the same. And if you remember the punchline, it'll work out. But you often change it around. In fact, all of us have had the experience of listening to someone tell a joke. And when you start out, you think you haven't heard it before, but about halfway into it or a little further, you figure out that it's an old joke you've heard many times. They're just telling it differently than you've ever heard it told before, and you didn't recognize it at first. Well, that's the way it is when you run through these sections. Each one will be a little different. And it's important to remember that this all comes very naturally. When you are running through each section, you don't have to be thinking about what you're going to say. It'll just come to you as you say it. Your brain gets involved here completely. Everything is connected. And so it enables you to say what is on the page, even though you say it in a little different way. And it will have the same exact meaning as what you wrote, but it will not be in the same words. Words and phrases change, the meaning and content remain the same. And remember, if you start saying these things exactly the same every time, then you've moved into memorizing it. And you don't want to do that. Don't run through it so many times that you have it all down pat so that you say exactly what you wrote. Then you're not preaching freely again. So some examples of how some examples now of how and things that you need to do in order to have a good rehearsal and a powerful rehearsal experience. The first thing you need to do, practically speaking, is decide on where you are going to do your rehearsals. Some of these things seem awfully simple, but this is very important. Where are you going to rehearse? You need absolute privacy. And so the best possible place would be from the pulpit and be able to go in your sanctuary or your church and preach from that. Or if you use a lectern or some other way, preach from the sanctuary. But sometimes that's not available. So maybe there's a little chapel in your church where you can go and rehearse your sermon and have privacy. I've done many things at churches. I've gone into Sunday school rooms, set up a few chairs in my lectern and rehearsed thinking the congregation is there. It really helps to have it set up so that it seems like there's a congregation there that you're talking to. So set it up somehow in that way. Now, you can be very creative when it comes to where you're going to do your rehearsals. I had a student write me one time and she said, I do my rehearsals on my walk around the lake on Saturday night. I take my manuscript with me and I'm walking and I'm talking out loud to myself and people think I'm nuts when they pass me, but I don't care. And that's where I do my oral rehearsals. So, and in my own case, now that I'm not working in a parish, if I have to preach someplace or speak, I can do my oral rehearsals from my Barca lounger. It's just, you have to be in a private place. That's the most important thing in this regard. Choosing a time for your rehearsals. When are you going to do your rehearsals? That's a key thing in this whole business of being able to speak extemporaneously. It takes about an hour to an hour and a half to prepare a 10-minute or a 15-minute sermon, 4 or 5 pages of manuscript. And this has to be an unhurried process. You can't be pressed. You need to be relaxed, have a time to do these rehearsals. Now, what I'm going to say next is of utmost importance. These rehearsals have to be very close to the time you deliver your sermon. The closer the rehearsal is to the actual time of delivery, the better. If you can rehearse them right before you preach, the morning, Sunday morning, before you preach, that's the best. Now you can rehearse them Saturday night. You can do your run-throughs on Saturday night, but you have to do your run-throughs within 24 hours of the actual delivery time. You cannot rehearse your sermons on Friday or Thursday or whenever you had your sermon manuscript written and expect to remember it on Sunday. What we're dealing with here is some kind of short-term memory. I call it 24-hour memory. After 24 hours, it's pretty hard to remember what you rehearsed. So you have to make sure your rehearsals are at least Saturday night, evening, or best possible scenario, Sunday morning. And of course, the fact that you forget your sermons is, or what you've mastered in your rehearsals very quickly is a good thing. It's called transients. Your brain forgets things in order to make room for new things. You wouldn't want last Sunday's sermon rattling around your brain when you're trying to remember this Sunday's sermon. And it's gone. By the time you get to practicing this week's sermon, boy, you don't remember last week's sermon. I can actually remember in the parish sometimes I would be downtown or something Wednesday after a Sunday sermon, and someone would stop me and say, Pastor Larson, I really liked your sermon on Sunday. That meant so much to me. And I'd thank them, and I would then try to think of what it could have possibly been that I said. And I might remember some things about that sermon, but most of it's gone. In general, you could remember some of it, but not very much. So this means that the best time to run through a sermon is right before you deliver it. And Sunday morning is, of course, the best. Well, now in my older age, I get to I run through it on Saturday night if I'm preaching, and then I run through it again on Sunday morning before I go to the church, and that seems to help. Have a couple run-throughs. One of the reasons I believe people give up on trying this and preaching extemp is because they rehearse too far in advance. They don't realize that, sure, they might have been able to say it on Wednesday, but now they can't say it come Sunday morning, and they're worried about that. And so it's a very key issue, this issue of having it in your, remembering that it's a short-term memory situation. And don't worry that you won't be able to do it. Now, what I would do in the latter part of my ministry is I would write my sermons on Friday. I would take the manuscript and I'd stick it in my hymnal, and I wouldn't think about it until Sunday morning. And by the time I was on my way to church on Sunday morning, because I rehearsed at church before services, I can remember many times not remembering what I'd written, not remembering what the sermon was about at all. And yet, I would get to church, I would do my run-throughs, and after 2 hours or so, I would be able to speak that sermon from my heart, completely freely, sometimes without even looking at the manuscript more than a few times. And that's a very powerful thing, and it communicates well. Now, just again, some practical ideas about how to go about it. What I would do is take up a music stand. And in my case, I usually sat down, and I would set the music stand to the side. Or if you're going to speak from the pulpit and you have your manuscript up in the pulpit, you can rehearse from there, be sure you're able to step aside from the pulpit when you actually try to say it. Because if it's right in front of your face and you're able to look down all the time, and you have a tendency to look down to see what comes next, you need to have this situation where you don't know what comes next, so you got to think about it. And you got to try to say it without looking at it. So keep it off to the side somehow when you're doing the run-throughs. Now, you take a look at what you have written in that first section. And maybe it's a story, as I said, or a retelling of the text or something like that. And you identify that chunk. And this is the part you're going to run through 3-4 times and try to get it so that you can speak it freely. Unless it's a story. or retelling the text, it's going to take at least 3 times. Sometimes it might even take a couple more extra times, but 3 usually is the charm. Once you've got it, tried it 3 different times, it usually works. But after that first time, you look back and you look at the manuscript and you maybe underline something, or you circle a word, or you number certain number of things, these 3 things. You mark your text up. Marking the text is a very important part of this. And you could use highlighters if that's what you like. I just use a pen, and so I can write things in there. Don't have to be changing writing utensils when I'm doing this. But you write an awful lot, and you know, mark the blocks, the sections. You may want to title them. You may want to put keywords or big keywords, put brackets around things. All kinds of ways that you can mark up the text. And this is what you take into the pulpit with you, your marked up text. Don't reprint the text and then take that manuscript without any of the markings, because the markings are there to help you. In fact, if you added some things to your manuscript after you preached it, after you practiced it, and things ended up in different places on the page, your brain will look for it at the bottom of this page, and here it's moved to the top now because you added something. That's why you have to use the manuscript that you practiced with for the delivery of the sermon, because your brain remembers where things are and it starts looking for them. The key is to remember that 3 times is the charm. Sometimes it might take 4 or 5 times if it's really confusing or very difficult. But one of the secrets that I found is that if you read a section through and it seems so very difficult that you can't possibly think you're going to be able to preach this freely. I've tried to do this sometimes, and I've said, this is too complicated. I read it and say, I can't say this freely. It's not going to work. It's worked for 25 years, but this is going to stump me right here. That's when you do something that I think is a real neat trick. You look at your watch and you say, okay, I'm gonna work on this section for 15 minutes or 10 minutes or something. And if after that time, trying to run through it, I can't get it, then I will revert to reading part of it in the sermon or whatever. And I'll guarantee you, it'll never happen. You will always be able to come up with something. Your brain will work it out. You just have to put in the time and do it. So once you have finished that first block, then you go on to the next block. Now, as you start that second block, you may want to tie it into the first one a little bit, look at the last sentence or something, the last thought, so that you work on the transitions. Transitions are very important in preaching from one section of the sermon to the other, and so that might help you. But once you have a section down pat, you never go back to it. You never preach it again in your rehearsals until you actually deliver it on Sunday morning. Unless you want to, after you're all done, to go through the whole sermon again, but that's not necessary. You have that section down so that when you get in the pulpit to finally preach it, you don't have to have run through the whole thing. You know this section, and then you know this section, and you just have to go from one to the next. Sometimes, as I say, things come easier. Some will only take 1 or 2 rehearsals and run-throughs, and some will take a few more. And when you're first starting out on this, it might take a few more than later on. You'll be surprised how slowly the time goes when you're rehearsing. You think that this is forever, but it isn't. And you can get an awful lot done in a fairly short amount of time. Now you think an hour and a half of rehearsal in order to change it from a written communication to an oral communication, one that may communicate some to to one that communicates in a dynamic and powerful way, that's not a lot of time to pay for that. When you think about how much time you put into writing the sermon and the research into the sermon, the text studies, all the other things that you had to do to get ready to preach, then not adding this hour and a half of rehearsal so that you can do it well in an oral way, doesn't seem like that big a price to pay. And yet, it is what prevents people from doing it, because they just don't want to put in the rehearsals. If you don't want to orally rehearse your sermon, you're never going to be able to speak it freely. And so that's just the facts of life. But remember, your brain produces a little miracle here as you go through this. And it's something that everybody can do. All people are the same. I never had a student who couldn't do this. Some did it a little quicker. They picked up on it a little faster. Maybe they had a little better verbal skills. Maybe they're older, more experienced. But generally speaking, everybody can do it. It's not something that's unique to certain human beings, which I think sometimes people thought in the past is, well, he can speak freely because he's just the brain or something. You're not going to be looking at, during the final presentation of your sermon, you don't look at your notes for any other reason than to see what comes next. You're not going to read any of it. And that's very important, because you see what comes next and then you try to say it. Even when you're presenting the sermon, you're just trying to say it. And you don't revert to reading again what you have written. And people don't mind if you look down to see what comes next, as long as you come back to them and speak freely. I've been checking my notes here as I've been speaking to you. And I'm sure you notice it's not that big of a distraction. In fact, I kind of like it when I see this pastor looking at their notes. I know they wrote something. I know they worked on this. So looking at your notes is not a distraction. What's a distraction is reading them. So after you look to see what comes next, and you can take a little time for that, what comes next, and then get up and start talking to the people. As long as you come back to them, they'll be fine with your looking down. There's one exception to that, and that is quotations. If there is something, you're going to quote somebody or scripture or something, you can read those. You should read those. And you look down, but you have to let the people know you're going to read something. So you'll say, the Apostle Paul in Romans 5:12 says this. And then you read it. And then, or Malcolm Muggeridge in his book such and such says this. When you're done reading the quote, you just start speaking freely again, and people will realize that you're done with the quotation. In conclusion, I just want to say, remember that every time you speak a section, you'll say it a little differently. And at first, that's kind of disconcerting, because maybe one run through, you really said it well. The next run through, you didn't say it so good. So you want to say it the way you said it the first time, but then you don't. You never can quite get back to that. But who knows, maybe the best time will be when you're with the audience and with the congregation. And often that's the case, because when you're in front of people, the juices really start working in you, and you get excited about it, and you're really focused on what you want to get across in your sermon. If you come up with something that's really good in your run-throughs, be sure and write them down on your manuscript so that you can run through it, and share that in your final sermon. But don't write everything down. Don't write all the little changes that you've made, that neat ways of saying things. I mean, those things will change. But if it's an important thing that you want to be sure and include, you can write that down. In my book, I have a video that I include that shows me orally rehearsing my sermons. This is something I did for my classes. I would always spend an hour showing them how to do these oral rehearsals. I would take an old sermon that I hadn't looked at for months, and I would rehearse it for half an hour, 40 minutes, the first part of it, and then I would deliver it. Well, I put that on a video and included that in the dust jacket of my book. And I think it's helpful, and so I'm going to upload that onto this series at the end so that you can sit and watch it. It's somewhat like watching paint dry, watching me do it. And so that's why you can't have people watching you do this. It's embarrassing in a way. But by watching that, perhaps it would help you to see just how it's done. And then at the end, I get up and I do preach it freely, and I think that's an effective thing to do is to watch that video. If you have any questions, be sure and contact me. My email is jerlarson39@gmail.com. If you have any questions about this lecture or the others, or questions about my book or any of that, just email me at that address. So the next lecture will be on writing sermons. So until then, we'll see you later.